The first thing Odysseus heard was not the roar of the sea. It was singing, soft at first, beautiful, almost human, the kind of song that seemed to know every regret he had ever carried, every secret he had never spoken, and every dream that still pulled him toward home. Around him, the sea was calm, too calm. His ship moved through the blue water while his men rowed with wax sealed inside their ears. They could not hear the voices calling from the island. But Odysseus could. He had ordered himself tied to the mast. He had warned his crew that no matter how desperately he begged, no matter what promises he made, they must not release him. Then the song grew louder. It promised knowledge. It promised glory. It promised that every mystery of the world could be his if he only stepped ashore. Odysseus pulled against the ropes until they cut into his skin. He shouted at his men to free him. They only rowed harder. And as the island slowly disappeared behind them, Odysseus understood something terrible. The greatest danger on his journey was not always a monster. Sometimes, it was the part of himself that wanted to stop fighting. This was the journey of a king who helped destroy the greatest city of his age, then discovered that winning a war was easier than returning home. It was a voyage filled with gods, giants, storms, witches, ghosts, temptation, pride, and loss. But beneath all of it was one simple desire. A man wanted to see his wife again. A father wanted to meet the son he had left as a child. And a ruler wanted to reclaim a home that was slowly being stolen from him. The Odyssey begins after the Trojan War. For 10 long years, the Greeks had fought outside the walls of Troy. Kings had died. Heroes had fallen. Armies had burned cities and buried generations of young men. Odysseus, king of the small island of Ithaca, had become famous not because he was the strongest warrior, but because he was the cleverest. According to the tradition remembered in later Greek storytelling, he helped devise the wooden horse that allowed Greek soldiers to enter Troy and bring the war to its final, brutal end. When the city fell, the surviving Greeks prepared to sail home. For many of them, the war was over. For Odysseus, the real punishment was only beginning. He left Troy with 12 ships and hundreds of men. He would return to Ithaca years later with no ships, no army, and no companions. The sea would take everything, but not all at once. That would have been merciful. At first, Odysseus and his men sailed north to the land of the Cyclones. They attacked the coastal city of Ismarus, killed many of its defenders, and divided the wealth. Odysseus ordered his men to leave quickly. They refused. They celebrated on the beach, drinking wine and slaughtering animals. While they delayed, the Cyclones called for reinforcements from the interior. At dawn, a larger force arrived. The Greeks were driven back to their ships, losing men from every vessel. It was the first warning. The habits that had helped them survive war would destroy them during peace. They still thought like raiders. They still believed victory made them untouchable. The gods, the sea, and the people whose homes they entered would teach them otherwise. A storm pushed the fleet off course. For days they struggled against wind and water until they reached a strange shore. There, some of Odysseus's men encountered the Lotus eaters. These people offered them a plant that brought forgetfulness. The men who tasted it did not collapse. They did not scream. They simply stopped caring. They forgot Ithaca. They forgot their families. They forgot why they had ever wanted to leave. To Odysseus, that peaceful surrender was more frightening than violence. He dragged the affected men back to the ships and tied them beneath the benches. Then he ordered the fleet away before anyone else could taste the lotus. The journey had revealed its first trap. Not death, not pain, comfort. The temptation to abandon the difficult road home. Soon the ships reached a wild island near the land of the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes were described as enormous one-eyed beings who lived without assemblies, shared laws, or organized cities. Odysseus saw smoke rising from the nearby coast. Curiosity drew him toward it. He selected a group of men and crossed the water to investigate. They found a large cave filled with sheep, goats, baskets of cheese, and containers of milk. Odysseus's companions wanted to steal what they could and escape. Odysseus refused. He wanted to meet the owner. He wanted to see what kind of creature lived there. He also expected the ancient custom of hospitality. In the world of Homer's poem, hospitality was sacred. A stranger could arrive at a home, receive food and shelter, and only later be asked his name. To violate that custom was not merely rude. It offended Zeus, protector of guests and travelers. But the owner of the cave did not fear Zeus. At sunset, the Cyclops Polyphemus returned with his flock. He drove the animals inside, then rolled a stone across the entrance. The stone was so large that no group of ordinary men could move it. Odysseus and his companions were trapped. Polyphemus saw the strangers and demanded to know who they were. Odysseus appealed to the laws of hospitality. The Cyclops laughed. He said the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus. Then he grabbed 2 of the men, smashed them against the ground, and ate them. The cave became silent except for the sound of the giant's meal. Odysseus reached for his sword. Then he stopped. If he killed Polyphemus, no one would be able to move the stone blocking the exit. Courage would not save them. Only patience would. The next morning, the Cyclops ate 2 more men and left with his flock, sealing the cave behind him. Odysseus began to plan. He found a heavy olive-wood club inside the cave. He and his men sharpened it to a point, hardened it in the fire, and hid it beneath the dung. When Polyphemus returned, Odysseus offered him strong wine taken from Ismarus. The Cyclops drank greedily. He demanded to know Odysseus's name. Odysseus answered with one of the most famous lies in ancient literature. "My name is Nobody." Polyphemus promised that Nobody would be the last man he ate. Then the wine overcame him. He fell backward into a drunken sleep. Odysseus and his remaining companions heated the wooden stake in the fire. Together they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus awoke with a scream that shook the cave. Other Cyclopes rushed toward the entrance from outside and asked who was attacking him. Polyphemus shouted that Nobody was killing him. Believing the problem was some illness sent by the gods, they left. The lie had worked, but the men were still trapped. At dawn, Polyphemus sat at the cave entrance and felt the backs of his sheep as they passed outside. Odysseus tied his men beneath the largest animals. He held himself under the belly of the strongest ram. The blind Cyclops touched the backs of the sheep, never realizing that his prisoners were hanging beneath them. One by one, the men escaped. They reached the ship and pushed away from shore. They had survived because Odysseus had been patient, inventive, and disciplined. Then pride destroyed the victory. From the safety of the sea, Odysseus mocked the blinded giant. His men begged him to remain silent. He shouted again. And finally, he revealed his real name. Polyphemus raised his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. His father was Poseidon, god of the sea. The Cyclops asked Poseidon to prevent Odysseus from reaching home, or, if fate still allowed him to return, to make the journey long, painful, and empty of companions. The prayer was heard. Odysseus's intelligence had saved him. His pride had condemned him. From that moment, the sea itself became his enemy. The surviving ships sailed to the floating island of Helios, keeper of the winds. Helios welcomed Odysseus and listened to the story of Troy. When the Greeks prepared to leave, he gave Odysseus a remarkable gift. He trapped every dangerous wind inside a leather bag, leaving only the west wind free to carry the fleet toward Ithaca. For 9 days they sailed. On the 10th, Odysseus saw the fires of his homeland in the distance. After years of war and wandering, Ithaca was finally within reach. Exhausted, Odysseus fell asleep. His crew stared at the mysterious bag. They believed Helios had filled it with gold and silver. They believed their king was hiding treasure from them. Jealousy overcame loyalty. They opened the bag. The trapped winds exploded across the sea. The ships were driven backward, away from Ithaca, and all the way to the island of Helios. Odysseus begged for help again. This time Helios refused. He decided that any man hated so deeply by the gods could not be saved. Odysseus returned to the ships with nothing. The coast of Ithaca had been visible. Then, in a single moment, it was gone. The fleet sailed on until it entered a narrow harbor surrounded by cliffs. 11 ships moved inside. Odysseus, cautious after so many disasters, anchored his own vessel outside the harbor. The land belonged to the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals. Their king attacked the scouts sent by Odysseus. Then the cliffs filled with enormous figures hurling rocks down onto the ships. The harbor became a trap. Wood shattered. Men fell into the water. The giants speared the struggling sailors like fish. Because Odysseus had anchored outside, his ship alone escaped. The fleet that had left Troy was gone. Hundreds of men had been reduced to one desperate crew. They reached the island of Ea, home of the goddess Circe. Odysseus divided the survivors into two groups. One remained with the ship. The other explored the island under the command of Eurylochus. Deep in the forest, the men discovered a beautiful palace surrounded by strangely tame wolves and lions. Inside, Circe welcomed them with food and wine, but she mixed drugs into the meal. When the men finished eating, she touched them with her wand. They became pigs. Their minds remained human. Their bodies did not. Only Eurylochus escaped. He returned to the coast and told Odysseus what had happened. Odysseus took his sword and went alone towards Circe's palace. On the way, the god Hermes appeared. He gave Odysseus a magical plant called moly and warned him how to resist Circe's spell. When Circe offered the drugged wine, Odysseus drank. She touched him with her wand. Nothing happened. He drew his sword. Circe, suddenly afraid, realized the gods were protecting him. She returned his men to human form. They emerged younger and stronger than before. What began as another deadly trap became a period of rest. Odysseus and his crew remained with Circe for an entire year. They ate. They drank. They recovered from the sea. And once again, home began to fade from their minds. Finally, the men reminded Odysseus of Ithaca. Circe agreed to help them leave. But first, she said, Odysseus had to travel somewhere no living man willingly went. He had to enter the world of the dead. Odysseus needed the guidance of the prophet Tiresias. Only Tiresias could tell him how to survive the journey ahead. The ship sailed to the edge of ocean, to a dark land where the sun barely touched the sky. Odysseus dug a trench and poured offerings for the dead. Then he sacrificed animals, and the shades of the underworld gathered around the blood. Among them was Elpenor, one of his own men. Elpenor had died on Circe's island after falling from a roof while drunk. In the rush to leave, no one had buried him. His spirit begged Odysseus to return and perform the proper rites. The dead still demanded respect. Even forgotten men wanted their names remembered. Then Odysseus saw the ghost of his mother, Anticlea. She had been alive when he sailed to Troy. Now she stood among the dead. Odysseus tried to embrace her 3 times. 3 times his arms passed through nothing. She told him that Penelope remained loyal. Telemachus, the son Odysseus had left as an infant, had grown into a young man. His father Laertes lived in grief, and she herself had died not from disease or violence, but from sorrow and longing for her absent son. For the first time, Odysseus fully understood that the war had continued destroying lives long after the fighting ended. The people waiting at home had suffered too. Tiresias finally appeared. He warned Odysseus that Poseidon's anger still followed him. He said the crew would reach an island where the sacred cattle of the sun god, Helios, grazed. No matter how desperate they became, they must not harm those animals. If they obeyed, some might survive. If they did not, the ship and crew would be destroyed. Odysseus would return home alone, and even then, he would find trouble waiting inside his own palace. Before leaving the underworld, Odysseus saw other dead heroes of Troy. Agamemnon told him how he had returned from war only to be murdered in his own home. Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, spoke words that shattered the glamour of heroic death. He said he would rather live as the poorest servant than rule over all the dead. The war had promised immortal glory. The underworld revealed the cost. Odysseus returned to Circe's island, buried Elpenor, and prepared for the next stage of the voyage. Circe warned him of the sirens. Their song drew sailors toward a shore covered with bones. Odysseus wanted to hear them, but he also wanted to survive. He ordered his men to soften wax and seal their ears. They tied him to the mast. When the sirens sang, they claimed to know everything that had happened at Troy. They promised wisdom no other mortal possessed. Odysseus begged to be released. The men tightened the ropes. They sailed beyond the island. Knowledge itself had become a weapon. Then came a choice between 2 horrors. On one side of a narrow passage waited Charybdis, a monstrous force that swallowed the sea and vomited it back in a deadly whirlpool. On the other waited Scylla, a creature with multiple heads who seized sailors from passing ships. Circe had warned Odysseus that he could not defeat both. He would have to choose the lesser disaster. Odysseus steered closer to Scylla. He did not tell the crew what was waiting. As they watched Charybdis in terror, Scylla struck. 6 men were lifted from the deck. Odysseus saw them, reaching toward him, shouting his name as the creature carried them away. He later described it as the most terrible sight of the entire journey. There had been battles. There had been storms. But this was different. He had knowingly led men toward death because the alternative would have killed everyone. Leadership had become the art of choosing who would not survive. The remaining crew reached the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle of Helios grazed. Odysseus repeated Tiresias's warning. The men swore they would leave the animals untouched. Then storms trapped them on the island. Days became weeks. Their food disappeared. Hunger replaced discipline. While Odysseus slept, Eurylochus spoke to the crew. He argued that starving slowly was the worst possible death. Better to kill the cattle, offer part to the gods, and face whatever punishment followed. The men slaughtered the sacred animals. When Odysseus awoke, it was too late. Even the hides seemed to move. The meat made strange sounds over the fire. Helios demanded justice from Zeus. When the storm finally ended, the crew launched the ship. Zeus sent a thunderbolt. The vessel broke apart. Every remaining companion died. Odysseus clung to wreckage. The prophecy had been fulfilled. He had left Troy with a fleet. Now he floated alone. The currents carried him back toward Charybdis. He survived by holding to the branch of a tree above the whirlpool until pieces of the wreckage reappeared. Then the sea carried him for days until he reached the island of Ogygia. There lived Calypso, a beautiful and powerful goddess. She rescued him. She cared for him. She offered him a life without age. If he remained with her, he would never grow old. He would never die, but he would also never return to Ithaca. For 7 years, Odysseus lived on her island. Calypso loved him. Yet Homer's poem repeatedly shows him sitting beside the sea, staring toward the horizon and weeping. He had been offered immortality. He wanted home. The story then turns away from Odysseus and travels to Ithaca. Almost 20 years had passed since he left. His palace had been invaded by more than 100 suitors from Ithaca and the surrounding islands. They wanted Penelope to choose one of them as her new husband. They ate Odysseus's livestock. They drank his wine. They insulted his servants. They treated the palace as if its owner were already dead. Penelope resisted them through intelligence. She announced that she would select a husband after completing a burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's elderly father. Each day, she worked at the loom. Each night, she secretly undid part of the weaving. For 3 years, the deception delayed the marriage. Eventually, a servant revealed the truth. The suitors became more aggressive. Odysseus's son Telemachus had grown up surrounded by men who mocked his authority and consumed his inheritance. He remembered almost nothing of his father. Athena, goddess of wisdom and Odysseus's greatest divine supporter, appeared in disguise and urged Telemachus to act. He traveled to the courts of Nestor and Menelaus, searching for news. There he learned that the generation of Troy had returned home broken, scattered, or dead. Some had reached their families. Some had been murdered. Some, like Odysseus, had vanished. Back on Ogygia, the gods finally intervened. Athena persuaded Zeus that Odysseus had suffered long enough. Hermes carried the order to Calypso. She had to release him. Calypso protested. She accused the male gods of hypocrisy. They often took mortal lovers, yet became angry when goddesses did the same. Still, she obeyed. Odysseus built a raft. Calypso gave him food, water, clothing, and directions. He sailed away. Poseidon saw him. The sea god had not forgotten Polyphemus. He sent a storm that destroyed the raft. Odysseus nearly drowned. With the help of a sea goddess and Athena, he reached the land of the Phaeacians. He crawled from the water, covered himself with leaves, and fell asleep beneath the bushes. The next morning, the princess Nausicaa came to the river with her attendants. Athena had sent her there in a dream. Odysseus emerged from the trees, naked, exhausted, and salt-crusted. He chose his words carefully. He did not rush toward the women. He spoke from a distance. Nausicaa recognized that beneath the ruined appearance stood a man of discipline and intelligence. She gave him clothing and directed him toward the palace of her parents, King Alcinous and Queen Arete. The Phaeacians welcomed the stranger. At first, Odysseus did not reveal his name. During a feast, a blind singer performed stories from the Trojan War. Odysseus covered his face and wept. The king noticed. He asked the stranger who he truly was. Only then did Odysseus reveal his identity and tell the story of the years between Troy and the Phaeacian shore. The Phaeacians were moved. They loaded a ship with gifts and carried him toward Ithaca while he slept. At last, Odysseus touched his homeland. He did not recognize it. Athena had covered the island in mist. The Phaeacian sailors placed him and his treasure on the shore, then departed. Poseidon punished them for helping his enemy by turning their returning ship to stone near the harbor. Odysseus awoke alone. Athena appeared and revealed that he was finally home. But the journey was not over. The suitors controlled the palace. Many servants had chosen their side. If Odysseus entered openly, he might be killed before he reached the throne. Athena transformed him into an old beggar. His skin wrinkled. His hair vanished. His clothing became filthy. The king of Ithaca would return to his own home as a stranger. He first went to the hut of Eumaeus, a loyal swineherd. Eumaeus welcomed the unknown beggar, fed him, and spoke with love about his missing master. Odysseus listened without revealing himself. The loyalty of a servant had survived when the loyalty of nobles had failed. Telemachus soon returned from his journey. The suitors had planned to ambush and kill him at sea, but Athena helped him escape. He went to Eumaeus' hut. There, Athena restored Odysseus's true appearance for a moment. Telemachus stared at the stranger and believed he must be a god. Odysseus told him the truth. "I am your father." Telemachus did not accept it at first. He had spent his life hearing rumors. He had imagined this meeting too many times. Then Odysseus embraced him. Both men wept. The father had left behind a baby. He had returned to find an adult. There was no time to recover the missing years. They had to prepare for war inside their own house. Odysseus ordered Telemachus to return to the palace and act normally. He would follow in disguise. Together, they would remove the weapons from the great hall and discover which servants could still be trusted. When Odysseus entered the city as a beggar, no crowd recognized him. At the palace gate lay an old dog named Argos. Years earlier, Odysseus had raised him for hunting. Now Argos was neglected, weak, and covered with parasites. His master passed in disguise. The dog lifted his ears. He recognized Odysseus. The king turned away to hide his tears. Argos lowered his head and died. He had waited 20 years to see his master once more. Inside the palace, the suitors mocked the beggar. One of them, Antinous, struck him with a stool. Odysseus endured the insult. The warrior who had faced giants and storms now had to master his anger in his own hall. Penelope heard that the stranger might have news of her husband. She summoned him. Odysseus, still disguised, told her a carefully constructed story. He described clothing Odysseus had worn years earlier. The details were so exact that Penelope wept. Yet she did not accept hope easily. She had survived through caution. An old nurse named Euryclea washed the beggar's feet. She noticed a scar on his leg from a boar hunt during his youth. She recognized him. Odysseus grabbed her and ordered silence. The palace was filling with people who knew the truth. One careless word could destroy everything. Penelope then announced a final contest. She brought out Odysseus's great bow. The man who could string it and shoot an arrow through the holes of 12 axe heads would become her husband. The suitors agreed. One after another, they failed even to bend the bow. Telemachus nearly succeeded, then stopped when Odysseus signaled him. The disguised king asked for a chance. The suitors protested. Why should a beggar touch the weapon of a king? Penelope argued that the contest should be fair. Telemachus then took control and sent his mother back to her chambers. The bow was placed in Odysseus's hands. He examined it like a musician checking an instrument. Then he strung it effortlessly. The sound of the bowstring filled the hall. Zeus sent thunder. Odysseus released the arrow. It passed cleanly through all 12 axe heads. The room became still. Odysseus turned toward the suitors. The disguise had served its purpose. The time for patience was over. His first arrow struck Antinous, the most violent leader among them. At first, the others believed it was an accident. Then Odysseus revealed his name. He accused them of destroying his household, consuming his wealth, threatening his son, and pressuring his wife. The suitors tried to negotiate. They blamed Antinous. They offered repayment. Odysseus refused. The doors were locked. The weapons had been removed. Telemachus, Eumaeus, and another loyal servant stood beside him. The battle inside the hall was violent and close. The suitors used tables as shields. Some reached for weapons. A disloyal servant secretly brought armor from the storeroom until he was caught. Athena appeared in disguise, testing Odysseus and Telemachus before helping turn the fight. One by one, the suitors fell. Homer's audience would have understood the violence as punishment for a complete collapse of sacred law. The suitors had violated hospitality. They had entered another man's home, abused his family, wasted his property, plotted murder, and treated social order as something they could devour. Yet the scene is not triumphant in a simple way. The palace becomes a place of blood. Victory returns the house to Odysseus, but it cannot restore the 20 years already lost. When the fighting ended, Odysseus ordered the hall cleaned. The disloyal servants were punished. The loyal ones were protected. Then Euryclea ran to Penelope and announced that her husband had returned. Penelope did not believe her. Even when she entered the hall and saw Odysseus, she remained uncertain. He had been gone for nearly 2 decades. The man before her was older, changed, surrounded by the aftermath of violence. Penelope needed proof that no stranger, trickster, or god could provide. She ordered a servant to move their marriage bed outside the bedroom. Odysseus reacted immediately. The bed could not be moved. He had built it himself around the living trunk of an olive tree rooted inside the house. He had shaped the room around it. Only Odysseus, Penelope, and one trusted servant knew the secret. Penelope finally understood. This was her husband. The bed was more than furniture. It was the symbol of their marriage. A living tree turned into the center of a home. The world had moved around it. Wars had been fought. Kingdoms had fallen. Their bodies had aged. But the roots remained. Penelope crossed the room and embraced him. Odysseus wept again. The man who had resisted witches, monsters, and goddesses could not resist the sight of his wife believing him at last. They spent the night telling each other what had happened during the long separation. Odysseus described the sea. Penelope described the siege inside their home. His war had taken place across islands. Hers had taken place in the palace, one day at a time. But danger still remained. The families of the dead suitors gathered for revenge. Odysseus went to find his elderly father, Laertes. At first, he tested him with another false story. Then, seeing the old man's grief, he revealed himself. He proved his identity by showing the scar and recalling the trees Laertes had given him as a child. Again, recognition came through memory tied to the land. The scar, the bed, the orchard. Odysseus was not truly home because his feet touched Ithaca. He was home because people remembered the life he had lived there. The relatives of the suitors approached with weapons. Another cycle of revenge seemed ready to begin. Odysseus, Telemachus, and Laertes prepared to fight. Laertes killed the father of Antinous. Then Athena intervened. Zeus ordered peace. The people lowered their weapons. The story ended not with a final conquest, but with violence being stopped before it consumed another generation. The Odyssey has survived for thousands of years because it is far more than a story about monsters. The monsters are unforgettable. The Cyclops, the Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis. But the greatest threats are often human. Pride, greed, forgetfulness, hunger, jealousy, the desire to give up. Odysseus survives because he is intelligent, but his intelligence is never enough by itself. He also suffers because he wants credit for his victories. He escapes Polyphemus, then reveals his name. He reaches sight of Ithaca, but his divided crew opens the bag of winds. He warns his men about the cattle of Helios, but cannot keep them obedient. He is a hero whose greatest strengths repeatedly create new dangers. That is what makes him human. The poem also asks what home really means. Odysseus is offered pleasure by Circe. He is offered immortality by Calypso. He is offered peace among the Phaeacians. Still, he chooses Ithaca. Ithaca is not the richest kingdom. It is rocky, small, difficult, but it is his. Home is not presented as perfection. When he reaches it, the palace is occupied, his family is threatened, his father is broken by grief, and his dog is dying in the dirt. Home must be reclaimed. It must be recognized. It must sometimes be rebuilt. Penelope is just as important to that idea as Odysseus. She does not cross the sea. She does not fight giants. But for years she resists an invasion through patience and intelligence. She uses the loom the way Odysseus uses disguises. She delays. She observes. She tests. When her husband finally stands before her, she does not surrender to emotion. She demands proof. Odysseus survives because he knows when to hide his identity. Penelope survives because she knows when not to believe one. Telemachus represents the cost of absence. He grows up beneath his father's reputation without knowing the man. His journey is not only a search for Odysseus, it is a search for the courage to become himself. When father and son finally fight beside each other, they do not recover the lost childhood. They create a future from what remains. Even the gods in the Odyssey reflect uncertainty. Athena protects Odysseus, yet often makes him struggle before helping. Poseidon's anger begins with the blinding of his son, but it is intensified by Odysseus's pride. Zeus enforces justice, but mortals continue making choices that bring suffering upon themselves. At the beginning of the poem, Zeus complains that human beings blame the gods for disasters they create through their own recklessness. The entire story tests that idea. How much of Odysseus's suffering comes from fate? How much comes from the gods? And how much comes from decisions made by Odysseus and his men? There is no simple answer. That may be why the story still feels alive. Every generation understands the fear of being delayed. The fear that home will change before we return. The fear that those we love will no longer recognize us. The fear that after surviving the journey, we may discover that the hardest battle is waiting at the destination. Odysseus begins as a victorious king sailing from a conquered city. He ends as an older man standing beside the rooted bed he built before the war. The distance between those two moments is not measured only in miles. It is measured in names lost, ships destroyed, temptations resisted, mistakes remembered, and people who died waiting. History remembers Odysseus as the man of many turns. A man who changed plans, identities, stories, and strategies whenever survival demanded it. But the final truth of his journey is surprisingly simple. He wandered through a world filled with wonders. He met gods. He entered the land of the dead. He heard the sirens sing. He was offered eternal life. And after all of it, the greatest reward was not glory. It was a door he remembered, a tree that had not been uprooted, a woman who knew how to test him, and the right to say, after 20 years of war and sea, that he was finally home.